The waitress doesn't understand Arabic. She's just decoration. The sentence landed on the polished table with the confidence of a man who had never been told he was wrong. A few quiet chuckles followed. Crystal glasses shimmered beneath the amber glow of imported chandeliers. The soft hum of a jazz trio drifted through the ballroom like a current nobody noticed until it stopped mattering. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan glittered beneath the spring night sky, a city built on ambition, power, and the illusion that wealth could measure human worth. Inside the Grand Astoria Hotel, the annual Walker Global Ventures investment gala was underway. $600 million sat on the line. CEOs, venture capitalists, international partners, and media executives filled the room in tailored suits and designer gowns. Every conversation carried the weight of opportunity. Every smile concealed an agenda. At the center of it all sat Ethan Walker, 39 years old, billionaire founder of Walker Global Ventures. The financial press called him a visionary. Competitors called him ruthless. Employees called him brilliant when he was listening and impossible when he was not. Tonight, Ethan wore confidence like a custom-made suit. Relaxed, effortless, dangerous. Seated beside him were several investors from the Middle East discussing the final stages of a major acquisition that could reshape an entire industry. The deal had been months in the making. Lawyers had reviewed every clause. Analysts had projected every outcome. Journalists were already preparing headlines. To everyone watching, success felt inevitable. And standing quietly 3 feet behind Ethan's chair was Naomi Brooks, 27 years old, black, a waitress working the evening shift. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture straight, her movements precise. She moved through the room carrying silver trays and crystal glasses with the kind of grace that made people forget she was there. Most guests never looked directly at her. Some snapped their fingers. Others offered absent-minded nods. To them, Naomi was part of the scenery. Another employee blending into the luxury surrounding them. Invisible. At least that was what they believed. Ethan leaned slightly toward one of his investors as the conversation shifted into Arabic. The men spoke casually, comfortably, privately. Their voices lowered just enough to suggest secrecy, but not enough to hide their amusement. Ethan smirked. "She has no idea what we're saying," he replied in Arabic. "People like her never do." Another investor laughed softly. "Careful," one joked. "Maybe she's listening." Ethan glanced briefly toward Naomi before shaking his head. "Trust me, she's focused on the wine glasses." More laughter, the kind shared by people who mistake certainty for intelligence. Naomi continued pouring sparkling water into a guest's glass. Her expression never changed. Her eyes never lifted. Her hands remained perfectly steady. Across the room, cameras flashed as reporters documented handshakes and introductions. A server passed carrying trays of filet mignon sliders and truffle fries. The scent of expensive food mixed with polished wood and imported flowers. Everything looked perfect. But beneath the elegance, something else had entered the room. Something quiet. Something unseen. Because while Ethan Walker believed he was speaking freely, Naomi Brooks understood every word. Every joke. Every assumption. Every careless sentence spoken in a language they believed protected them. She heard the laughter. She heard the arrogance. And as the conversation continued, she heard something far more important than an insult. Something hidden inside the deal everyone had come to celebrate. Something that made her grip the serving tray just a little tighter. For the first time that evening, Naomi realized this was no longer just another shift. And before the night was over, the people sitting at that table would discover that the most dangerous person in the room was never the billionaire at the center of it. Naomi Brooks had spent years mastering the art of appearing unnoticed. In a city where people measured value by titles, neighborhoods, and numbers on a balance sheet, invisibility could become a kind of armor. She had learned that lesson long before she ever carried a serving tray through the polished halls of the Grand Astoria. As conversations swirled around her and laughter echoed beneath the chandeliers, Naomi continued moving from table to table with calm precision. But her mind was no longer focused on sparkling water or wine service. Every sentence she had just heard replayed with perfect clarity. Not because she was offended, not because she was surprised, but because something hidden inside that conversation refused to leave her thoughts. Across the ballroom, Ethan Walker was shaking hands with investors while photographers captured every smile. He looked exactly like the man the business magazines loved to feature on their covers. Confident, charismatic, untouchable. The kind of man who entered a room and expected gravity itself to adjust. Most people saw success when they looked at him. Naomi saw something else. She saw certainty. And certainty had a way of making people careless. A server passed beside her carrying a tray of champagne flutes. Naomi stepped aside gracefully and glanced toward the investor table again. Their discussion had shifted back into English for the benefit of nearby guests. The laughter remained. The confidence remained. Yet something felt different now, because she knew something they did not know. She understood every word they had spoken moments earlier. And understanding had always been Naomi's greatest strength. Years before, her life had looked completely different. At 19, she had earned a scholarship to Georgetown University. Professors described her as unusually gifted. Not because she studied harder than everyone else, although she often did. Not because she was naturally brilliant, although some believed that too. What set Naomi apart was curiosity. She treated languages like living maps. Every new phrase opened a door. Every conversation revealed a culture. Every accent carried a story. By the time she graduated, she could comfortably navigate conversations in Arabic, French, Spanish, and several regional dialects that most language students never attempted. Her dream had been simple. She wanted to work in international diplomacy. She wanted to build bridges between people who struggled to understand each other. But life rarely follows the plans we create for it. 3 years earlier, her mother received a diagnosis that changed everything. Medical appointments multiplied. Expenses grew. Priorities shifted overnight. Naomi accepted the first stable job she could find while helping support her family. One temporary position became another, then another. Eventually, she found herself working evenings at one of Manhattan's most prestigious hotels. Not because it had been her goal, because it had been necessary. Yet even now, she never stopped learning, never stopped reading, never stopped listening. Tonight, that habit was proving valuable in ways she could not yet explain. As she approached a side station to organize glassware, fragments of the earlier Arabic conversation surfaced again. Certain phrases stood out. Specific names. References to a subsidiary company. Mentions of documents scheduled for final approval after midnight. Individually, none of it seemed unusual. Together, however, the pieces formed a picture that made her uneasy. Naomi reached for a folded linen napkin and paused. Her reflection stared back from the polished silver serving tray. Calm face. Steady eyes. Professional smile. Nobody looking at her would guess what she knew. Nobody would imagine that the woman refilling water glasses had just understood a conversation worth hundreds of millions of dollars. At that moment, a voice echoed from across the ballroom. Ethan Walker was calling for service. Several heads turned. Naomi lifted her tray and began walking toward the table once more. The distance was only a few yards. Yet somehow it felt like she was stepping toward something much larger than another routine request. The moment Naomi arrived at Ethan Walker's table, she sensed a subtle shift beneath the polished surface of the evening. It was the kind of feeling that could not be measured on a balance sheet or summarized in a quarterly report. Something was moving underneath the conversation, hidden behind confident smiles and carefully chosen words. Ethan barely looked up as she approached. His attention remained fixed on the investors seated around him. The men appeared relaxed, comfortable, certain that the future unfolding before them belonged entirely to them. Naomi carefully placed a fresh bottle of sparkling mineral water beside the table. The crystal label reflected the chandelier light like a tiny mirror. "Thank you," one of the investors said absent-mindedly before returning to the discussion. Then the conversation shifted once again. English disappeared. Arabic returned. Smooth, fast, familiar. Naomi lowered her eyes and continued her work. To everyone watching, she was simply a waitress completing another task. But every word reached her clearly. Every sentence settled into place like pieces of a puzzle she had not realized she was solving. One investor mentioned a subsidiary company registered overseas. Another referenced documents scheduled to be finalized after midnight. A third quietly questioned whether the disclosures would attract regulatory attention. Ethan responded with calm confidence. "By the time anyone notices, the merger will already be complete," he said. A few men nodded. One laughed softly. Another raised his glass. Naomi's heartbeat slowed. Not because she was nervous, because she was concentrating. Her years studying languages had taught her an important lesson. Meaning rarely hides in individual words. It hides in patterns, connections, small details that seem harmless until they are placed beside each other. She continued arranging glasses on a nearby service station while the discussion flowed behind her. Then she heard a company name. A company she recognized from financial news articles she often read during lunch breaks. A company that was supposed to be independent, separate, unrelated to the acquisition being celebrated tonight. Yet according to the conversation unfolding at Ethan's table, that was not entirely true. Naomi remained perfectly still. A jazz piano drifted through the ballroom. Silverware clinked softly against fine china. Somewhere near the stage, a photographer instructed executives to stand closer together. The evening continued as if nothing unusual was happening. Yet the words she had just heard refused to leave her mind. One investor leaned toward Ethan. His voice lowered further. Naomi caught only fragments. Hidden ownership, deferred reporting, temporary structure. The phrases sounded technical, boring even, but together they painted a picture that felt increasingly wrong. Not illegal, perhaps. Not necessarily, but certainly different from the public story being presented tonight. Ethan smiled. The announcement tomorrow changes everything, he replied. Nobody will question the details once they see the numbers. Around the table, approval spread like a silent wave. Naomi carefully picked up an empty glass and turned away. Her reflection appeared briefly in the ballroom window. Beyond the glass, Manhattan's skyline stretched into the darkness. Thousands of lights. Thousands of stories, most of them unseen, just like hers. She told herself to keep moving, keep working, keep her thoughts to herself. Yet another part of her could not ignore what she had heard. Because this was no longer about a careless insult spoken by a billionaire who assumed she was invisible. This was about information. Information powerful people believed was safely hidden behind a language barrier. And as Ethan Walker raised his glass to celebrate a future he seemed certain he controlled, Naomi realized something that would soon change the course of the entire evening. The people at that table were guarding a secret. They simply did not know the wrong person had already heard it. Naomi tried to focus on the rhythm of her work. Pick up a tray. Deliver a drink. Clear a glass. Smile politely. Repeat. It was a routine she could perform almost without thinking. Yet tonight her thoughts refused to settle. The conversation she had overheard continued echoing beneath every sound in the ballroom. The jazz music, the laughter, the polite applause that occasionally rolled across the room whenever another executive arrived. All of it felt strangely distant now, like background noise surrounding something much more important. As she crossed the floor carrying a tray of sparkling water, she noticed Ethan Walker standing near a large digital display showcasing projections for the acquisition. Reporters gathered nearby. Investors nodded approvingly. Screens flashed growth, charts and market forecasts. The numbers were impressive. Hundreds of millions in projected value. Thousands of future jobs. Headlines waiting to be written. The story being presented was simple. A visionary company was expanding. A historic partnership was forming. Everyone would benefit. Yet the private conversation painted a more complicated picture. Naomi remembered the names she had heard. The references to layered ownership structures. The concern about disclosures. The confidence with which those concerns had been dismissed. She had spent enough time studying international business and diplomacy to recognize the language of people managing perceptions. Sometimes what mattered most was not what appeared in official presentations. It was what remained hidden behind them. Near the service station, another waitress named Brianna noticed Naomi's distracted expression. "You okay?" she asked quietly. Naomi offered a small smile. "Just a long night." Brianna nodded and returned to her section. The answer was technically true, but it was not the whole truth. Naomi could not explain why a growing sense of unease had settled over her. Nothing she heard had sounded dramatic. There were no threats, no shouting, no obvious wrongdoing. Just careful discussions among powerful people who seemed determined to keep certain details away from public attention. Yet that was exactly what troubled her. The room was filled with individuals whose decisions influenced markets, companies, and careers. Their words carried weight. Their choices affected lives they would never personally see. And tonight those choices were being discussed in a language most people around them could not understand. A few minutes later, Naomi passed near the investor table again. The conversation had resumed. This time one of the men appeared concerned. His tone sharpened slightly. What happens if someone connects the subsidiary before the announcement? He asked in Arabic. Ethan remained calm. Nobody will. He adjusted his cufflink and smiled. The structure only needs to hold for another 48 hours. Another investor nodded. And after that, Ethan lifted his glass. After that, nobody will care how the deal was assembled. They will only care that it succeeded. The confidence in his voice drew quiet laughter from the table. But Naomi noticed something else. One investor did not laugh. He looked uneasy. His fingers tapped lightly against the stem of his glass. His eyes shifted toward the presentation screens across the ballroom. It was a small reaction, easy to miss, yet it suggested uncertainty. And uncertainty rarely appeared among people who believed everything was under control. Naomi continued walking, but a realization settled over her with surprising clarity. The secret was bigger than she first imagined. Whatever arrangement was being finalized tonight involved information the public was not seeing. Information that investors, reporters, and even some business partners might not fully understand. She glanced toward the skyline glowing beyond the ballroom windows. The city seemed endless, powerful, certain of itself, much like Ethan Walker. Yet history had a habit of changing direction because of a single overlooked detail, a single conversation, a single person everyone underestimated. And as Naomi carried another tray through the sea of wealth and influence surrounding her, she could not shake the feeling that the overlooked detail tonight might be standing on her side of the room. The evening reached a turning point so quietly that almost nobody noticed it at first. The ballroom remained wrapped in warm light. Investors continued networking. Reporters moved between tables collecting quotes. Waiters carried trays through the crowd. Yet at Ethan Walker's table, a small moment was about to change everything. Naomi approached carrying a silver tray filled with fresh glasses. Her expression remained calm, professional, unreadable. Ethan barely acknowledged her presence. To him, she was still part of the background. Another employee performing another task. One of the investors glanced toward Naomi and smiled faintly. "Could we get another bottle of sparkling water?" he asked in English. Naomi nodded politely. "Of course, sir." As she reached for the empty bottle, the conversation shifted back into Arabic. The men appeared relaxed again, comfortable inside what they believed was a private space. One investor chuckled and said something that drew laughter from the table. Ethan smirked. "Do not worry," he replied. "We could discuss the entire deal right here, and nobody around us would understand a thing." Several men laughed. One raised his glass in agreement. The confidence was effortless, the assumption absolute. Then another investor looked toward Naomi. Perhaps he was amused, perhaps curious, perhaps simply caught up in the atmosphere of the evening. Whatever the reason, he spoke directly to her in Arabic. The question was simple, harmless on the surface, a test disguised as a joke. "Would you mind bringing us the reserve bottle from the side station?" More laughter followed. The investor leaned back in his chair, clearly expecting confusion. Ethan smiled without looking up from his phone. Around the table, several men waited for the familiar awkward pause that would confirm their assumptions. Instead, Naomi answered immediately. In fluent Arabic. Clear, natural, effortless. "Certainly, sir. The reserve bottle is already chilled and ready. I will bring it right away." Silence. The kind that arrives all at once. Forks paused halfway to plates. Conversations nearby faded into the background. One investor blinked. Another lowered his glass. Ethan's eyes lifted from his phone for the first time. Naomi did not stop there. She continued in Arabic with the calm confidence of someone discussing the weather. "Would you also prefer additional glasses for the guests arriving after the presentation? I heard you mention there may be 6 more joining the private meeting later tonight." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The investor who had asked the question stared at her. Then he slowly answered in Arabic. "You understood everything?" Naomi met his gaze politely. "Everything that was said at this table, sir." The words landed like thunder beneath velvet. Ethan sat completely still. The color drained from his confident smile. Around him, the investors exchanged uneasy glances. Naomi remained composed. She was not showing off, not attacking, not embarrassing anyone. Her tone stayed professional, respectful, measured. Somehow that made the moment even more powerful. One investor switched entirely to Arabic. "Where did you learn?" Naomi answered without hesitation. "I studied international relations and Arabic language at Georgetown University." I also spent time abroad during my academic training. Another investor looked genuinely astonished. Your pronunciation is excellent. Naomi smiled softly. Thank you, sir. For several seconds, nobody seemed to know what to say next. The room had not changed. The chandeliers still glowed. The music still played. Yet the balance of power around that table had shifted completely. Because the woman they had treated as invisible was no longer invisible. And for the first time that evening, Ethan Walker realized that the person who knew the most about his private conversation had been standing beside him all night. The silence lingered far longer than anyone expected. It spread across the table like a shadow, touching every investor, every advisor, every executive seated within earshot. Ethan Walker stared at Naomi as though he were seeing her for the first time. Moments earlier, she had been invisible. Now she had become impossible to ignore. One of the investors slowly set down his glass. You understood everything? He asked again in Arabic, as if repeating the question might somehow produce a different answer. Naomi nodded politely. Yes, sir. Her voice remained calm. There was no arrogance in it. No attempt to embarrass anyone. Just a simple statement of fact. That made the moment even more uncomfortable. Across the ballroom, conversations continued, but at this table the atmosphere had changed completely. Ethan leaned back in his chair. For perhaps the first time that evening, uncertainty appeared on his face. He studied Naomi carefully. The confidence that had carried him through countless negotiations suddenly seemed less certain. One investor exchanged a glance with another. The uneasy man who had remained quiet earlier finally spoke. Then you also heard the discussion about Crescent Holdings? Naomi recognized the name immediately. It was one of the companies mentioned repeatedly throughout the evening. She answered, carefully. I heard the name discussed several times. The investor's expression tightened. Ethan immediately stepped in. That is enough. His tone was firm but controlled. This conversation is confidential. Naomi met his gaze. Of course, sir. She neither challenged him nor backed away. The balance between them felt strangely different now. Ethan had spent years commanding rooms. Naomi had spent years being overlooked inside them. Yet in that moment, knowledge outweighed status. Around the table, the investors seemed unable to decide whether they were impressed or concerned. One of them smiled faintly. Your professors must have been proud. Naomi allowed herself a small smile. They encouraged me to keep learning. And now you work here? Another asked. The question carried genuine curiosity rather than judgment. Naomi glanced briefly around the ballroom. Life does not always follow the path we expect. Several investors nodded. The answer seemed to resonate more than anyone anticipated. Even Ethan looked away for a moment. The words hung in the air. Life does not always follow the path we expect. The statement felt true for everyone at the table, especially tonight. Then the uneasy investor spoke again. There is something else. His voice lowered. If she understood everything, then she knows details that have not been made public. No one responded immediately. The concern was obvious. Naomi could feel it. The room itself seemed smaller. The music farther away. Ethan folded his hands together and studied the table. For the first time all evening, he was not the most informed person in the conversation. Naomi had become an unexpected witness to discussions nobody intended her to hear. Not because she had been spying. Not because she had sought access. Simply because they had assumed she could not understand them. The irony settled heavily over the group. One careless assumption had transformed the entire evening. Ethan finally broke the silence. Miss Brooks, he said, how much exactly did you hear? Naomi looked directly at him. The question sounded simple, but everyone at the table understood its significance. She paused for a moment. Then she answered with complete honesty. Enough to know that some people in this room may not have the full story. The silence that followed felt even heavier than the first. The words settled over the table with surprising force. Enough to know that some people in this room may not have the full story. No accusation. No threat. Just a quiet observation. Yet it changed everything. The uneasy investor leaned forward. His expression sharpened. For the first time all evening, his attention was no longer fixed on the projected profits displayed across the ballroom. It was fixed on Naomi Brooks. Ethan Walker remained silent. His jaw tightened slightly. Around them, guests continued celebrating what they believed was a landmark business partnership. Glasses clinked. Laughter drifted through the air. Camera flashes reflected against polished marble columns. But inside this small circle, The mood had shifted completely. One investor spoke carefully. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Naomi chose her words with precision. Years of studying diplomacy had taught her that the wrong sentence could close a door forever. The right sentence could open one. "I mean that I heard references to ownership structures and reporting arrangements that were not mentioned during tonight's public presentation." Nobody interrupted her. "I may not know every detail," she continued, "but some of what was discussed privately sounded different from what was presented publicly." The uneasy investor exchanged glances with another partner. Their confidence appeared less certain now. Ethan folded his hands together. "You are drawing conclusions from fragments of a conversation." Naomi nodded respectfully. "That is possible." The honesty caught everyone off guard. She was not pretending to know more than she did. She was not exaggerating. She was simply describing what she heard. Somehow that made her credibility stronger. One of the international investors studied her carefully. "You said you studied international relations?" "Yes, sir." "And business law?" Naomi nodded. "Several courses. Corporate governance, international compliance, financial disclosure practices." The investor slowly leaned back. His eyes widened slightly. Suddenly the situation looked very different. Naomi was not simply someone who happened to understand Arabic. She possessed enough education to recognize the significance of what she had heard. Across the table, another investor frowned. "Why are we learning this now?" Nobody answered immediately. The question seemed directed at everyone. Ethan glanced toward the presentation screens across the ballroom. For the first time all evening, he appeared distracted. The uneasy investor finally reached into his jacket pocket and removed his phone. He opened several documents and began reviewing information. His eyes moved quickly across the screen. Then his expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for those watching closely to notice. Concern replaced confidence. A second investor leaned closer. Quiet questions followed. Numbers were checked. Ownership records reviewed. Details compared. The conversation became increasingly serious. Naomi remained standing beside the table, saying nothing. She did not need to. The information was beginning to speak for itself. Ethan watched the exchange unfold. The room that had once belonged entirely to him now felt less predictable. Control was slipping away, not because of an enemy, not because of a competitor, but because of a possibility he never considered. He had assumed nobody was listening. He had assumed nobody could understand. Most of all, he had assumed the woman carrying the tray had nothing valuable to contribute. The investors continued comparing notes. One of them finally looked up. "There are discrepancies here." The words were quiet, yet they landed harder than any speech delivered that evening. Nearby, the jazz band transitioned into a slower melody. The city lights beyond the windows continued shining over Manhattan. But at Ethan Walker's table, a carefully constructed narrative was beginning to crack. And the person responsible was not a journalist, a regulator, or a rival executive. It was the woman everyone had mistaken for part of the background. The atmosphere around the table changed faster than the market ever could. What began as a celebration was quietly becoming an investigation. The investors who had arrived expecting signatures and congratulations were now reviewing documents with growing concern. Phones appeared. Emails were opened. Financial records were cross-checked against information that had been presented throughout the evening. Nobody was raising their voice. Nobody needed to. The tension came from something far more powerful than volume. It came from doubt. Ethan Walker remained seated as the discussion unfolded around him. The confidence that had defined him earlier had not completely disappeared, but it no longer dominated the room. For years, he had been the person everyone followed. The person who always seemed 3 steps ahead. Tonight, however, questions were beginning to move faster than answers. One investor scrolled through a series of ownership filings and frowned. Another compared notes with an attorney who had joined the gala through a video call. The uneasy investor who first questioned the structure now appeared increasingly troubled. Every few minutes, another detail emerged. Another inconsistency. Another piece of information that deserved a closer look. Naomi stood quietly near the service station. She had returned to her responsibilities, refilling glasses and assisting guests. Yet everyone at the table remained aware of her presence. Not because she was speaking, because she no longer fit the assumptions they had made about her. The ballroom continued sparkling under the chandeliers. Guests still posed for photographs. A string of applause broke out near the stage after a keynote introduction. Most people attending the gala had no idea that the evening's most important conversation was happening away from the microphones. Then came the moment that shifted everything. One of the lead investors lowered his phone and looked directly at Ethan. "We need to pause tomorrow's announcement." The words landed with remarkable weight. Ethan stared at him. "Based on what?" The investor remained calm. "Based on the fact that several disclosures require clarification before we proceed." Another investor nodded. "We cannot move forward until every detail is verified." The response spread through the group. One after another, the partners agreed. Not because they believed wrongdoing had occurred, because uncertainty had entered the equation. And uncertainty was something serious investors could not ignore. Ethan looked around the table. For the first time all evening, nobody rushed to support his position. Nobody repeated his assurances. The momentum that had carried the deal forward for months suddenly stalled. Across the ballroom, a reporter approached one of the investors hoping to discuss the acquisition. The investor politely declined. That small interaction did not go unnoticed. Within minutes, speculation began spreading through the room. Nothing dramatic. Just whispers, questions, curious glances. The kind of signals experienced business journalists immediately recognize. The celebration no longer felt certain. Ethan leaned back in his chair and stared toward the skyline beyond the windows. Manhattan still glowed with the same confidence it had shown all night. Yet something fundamental had changed. Not only in the deal, in him, because he finally understood what had happened. The greatest risk to his carefully planned evening had not come from a competitor, a regulator, or a market crash. It had come from a person he never bothered to see. And as investors continued reviewing information that should have been examined long before tonight, Ethan found himself looking toward Naomi once again. Not as a waitress, not as background, but as the one person in the room whose honesty had forced everyone else to start paying attention. The gala ended very differently from how it began. The announcement scheduled for the following morning was postponed. The investors requested additional reviews. Attorneys asked new questions. Financial analysts reopened reports they thought had already been settled. No accusations were made. No dramatic confrontations unfolded. Yet everyone understood the same reality. A deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars had been forced to slow down because someone finally stopped assuming and started paying attention. As guests gradually left the ballroom, the energy that had filled the evening faded into thoughtful silence. The city, lights beyond the windows, still stretched across Manhattan like a sea of stars. Taxis moved through the streets below. Office towers glowed against the night sky. Life continued. But for Ethan Walker, something fundamental had shifted. He remained near the window long after many of the guests had departed. The room that had celebrated his success now felt strangely quiet. The applause was gone. The cameras were gone. The certainty was gone. Across the ballroom, Naomi Brooks continued helping the staff finish their closing responsibilities. Empty glasses were collected. Tables were cleared. Decorations were organized for removal. She worked with the same professionalism she had shown all evening. No victory speech. No celebration. No attempt to draw attention to herself. She simply did her job. Eventually, Ethan walked across the room toward her. Several employees noticed, but pretended not to. Naomi looked up as he approached. For a moment, neither spoke. The billionaire who had spent the evening commanding investors now seemed unusually thoughtful. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "I owe you an apology." Naomi listened quietly. Ethan glanced around the nearly empty ballroom. "Tonight, I made assumptions about you." He paused. "More than one." Naomi said nothing. She did not need to. Ethan exhaled slowly. "I thought I understood everyone in this room. I thought success gave me that ability." His eyes lowered briefly. "I was wrong." The honesty surprised even him. For years, people had praised his intelligence. Very few had challenged it. Fewer still had changed it. Naomi offered a small smile. Not triumphant, just kind. Most people see what they expect to see. Ethan nodded. The words landed harder than criticism, because they were true. He reached into his jacket and removed a business card. "If you ever decide to return to international relations, I would like to help." Naomi looked at the card but did not immediately take it. "I appreciate that." Ethan hesitated. No conditions. No publicity. No favors in return. Naomi studied him for a moment before accepting it. The gesture was simple, yet both understood its meaning. This was not charity. It was respect. The kind that should have existed from the beginning. A few minutes later, Ethan prepared to leave. As he turned toward the exit, he stopped one final time. You changed the course of tonight. Naomi shook her head gently. No, the facts did that. Ethan smiled for the first time in hours. A real smile. The kind built on humility instead of confidence. Then he walked away. Naomi watched the doors close behind him before returning to her work. The chandeliers dimmed. The music ended. Another night at the Grand Astoria came to an end. Yet the lesson remained. Wealth can command attention. Power can fill a room. Status can influence conversations. But none of those things determine a person's worth. Sometimes the smartest voice is the one nobody bothers to hear. Sometimes the most important truth comes from the person standing quietly in the background. And sometimes the difference between arrogance and wisdom is simply learning to see the humanity in someone you once overlooked. Ethan had entered the ballroom believing he was the most powerful person there. He left understanding something far more valuable. Power may open doors. Respect must be earned.